May 2026. Before sunrise, a military convoy rolled out of southern Ukraine carrying fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and equipment destined for troops far from the front line. Nothing about the mission appeared unusual. No major battle was taking place nearby. No enemy assault had been reported in the area. Yet somewhere along the route, something happened that is forcing military planners across the world to rethink how modern wars are fought. For decades, armies believed distance provided security. The farther a supply route was from the battlefield, the safer it became. Today, that assumption is being challenged in ways few expected, and the consequences may reach far beyond Ukraine. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military Force for more in-depth military and geopolitical analysis. To understand why this quiet shift matters, we first need to look at how the battlefield itself has changed. One of the biggest changes in this war is that the battlefield is no longer limited to the front line, and that shift is forcing military planners on both sides to rethink long-held assumptions about safety, distance, and control. For most of the conflict, danger was expected near trenches, artillery positions, and assault zones. Areas dozens of kilometers behind the fighting were usually considered support zones where supplies could move, commanders could coordinate operations, and troops could prepare for future missions. That idea is becoming harder to defend with each passing month. Since late 2024 and into 2026, Ukraine has steadily expanded the reach of its drone operations. Earlier in the war, most FPV drones and reconnaissance systems operated relatively close to active combat areas, often within 10 to 20 kilometers of the line of contact. Their mission was straightforward: spot enemy positions, guide artillery, and support nearby units. Today, the picture looks very different. Reports from multiple sectors suggest that Ukrainian drone strikes are now reaching 50, 75, 100, and in some cases even 150 kilometers behind Russian positions. That increase may sound like a technical detail, but it changes the geometry of war. Distance once provided protection. Commanders could move fuel, ammunition, and personnel through areas that were considered outside immediate danger. Now those same routes are being watched, tracked, and sometimes attacked. The result is that locations previously viewed as rear areas are increasingly becoming contested space. This trend is especially visible across parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. In Donetsk and nearby Makivka, locations that were once considered relatively secure have faced repeated strikes targeting military infrastructure. Similar pressure has been reported in Kherson and Zaporizhia, where supply movements have become more difficult as Ukrainian drone activity continues to expand. Even the southern corridor connecting occupied territories to Crimea has faced growing challenges as attacks reach deeper into areas that once appeared far removed from direct combat. What makes this development particularly important is not simply the drone itself, but the system supporting it. Ukrainian units are no longer relying on a single type of aircraft or isolated strike teams. Instead, they are combining reconnaissance platforms, long-range FPV systems, strike drones, battlefield surveillance networks, and real-time intelligence sharing. Information gathered by one operator can quickly be passed to another team many kilometers away. A target detected from the air can be identified, tracked, and attacked within a relatively short period of time. This creates a problem that every military fears. Movement becomes visible. A truck leaving a depot can be observed. A fuel convoy changing direction can be monitored. A temporary staging area may remain hidden for a few hours, but once discovered, its location can be shared across multiple units. The battlefield becomes more transparent, and transparency often favors the side that can react faster. Military analysts have increasingly described this as the gradual disappearance of the traditional rear area. In earlier wars, soldiers on the front line faced the greatest danger, while support personnel operating farther back enjoyed a much lower level of risk. Today, that difference is shrinking. A soldier inside a trench expects incoming fire. A truck driver transporting supplies 100 kilometers behind the line once expected a routine journey. Increasingly, both individuals must consider the possibility of being located from above. That psychological effect matters almost as much as the physical damage. When drivers hesitate to travel during daylight, when convoys take longer routes, and when commanders must constantly worry about detection, the entire system begins to slow down. No single strike needs to be decisive. The growing threat changes behavior, and changing behavior can reshape military operations across an entire region. What is emerging in Ukraine may be one of the most important lessons of modern warfare. The question is no longer where the front line is located. The question is how far the battlefield now extends beyond it. And nowhere is that expanding danger becoming more visible than along Russia's most important logistics arteries. If armies fight at the front, they survive because of what moves behind them. And nowhere is that reality more visible today than across the network of roads connecting southern Russia to occupied territories in Ukraine. While public attention often focuses on tanks, artillery, and battlefield assaults, military planners understand that wars are sustained by fuel deliveries, ammunition shipments, replacement personnel, spare parts, and food supplies. Without those essentials, even the strongest combat unit eventually loses its ability to operate effectively. For Russia, one of the most important systems supporting operations in southern Ukraine begins in Rostov-on-Don and stretches through Donetsk, Mariupol, Melitopol, and ultimately toward Crimea. These routes form a critical logistics corridor that allows supplies to move from Russian territory to units operating across hundreds of kilometers of frontline positions. Every day, trucks travel these roads carrying everything needed to keep military formations functioning. Fuel keeps vehicles moving. Artillery shells support combat operations. Medical equipment helps treat casualties. Replacement soldiers fill gaps left by losses. Even the growing drone force depends on a steady flow of batteries, electronics, explosives, and maintenance components. This transportation network became even more important after Russia established what many analysts describe as the land bridge to Crimea. Instead of relying mainly on maritime routes or the Kerch Bridge, Russian forces gained a continuous overland connection linking southern Russia to Crimea through occupied territory. From a military perspective, this created a more direct and flexible supply route. From a strategic perspective, it became one of the most valuable assets supporting Russian operations in the south. That value also makes it an attractive target. Over recent months, reports from Russian military observers, analysts, and open-source intelligence groups have described increasing pressure on traffic moving through these areas. Military trucks, fuel tankers, supply convoys, and temporary storage locations have faced growing risks as Ukrainian drone activity expands deeper into rear zones. In several sectors, drivers now operate under conditions that would have been considered unusual earlier in the conflict. Some reports have gone even further, describing sections of these routes as constant hunting grounds where drones search for opportunities to strike moving targets. According to open-source assessments cited by several observers, dozens of transport vehicles have reportedly been destroyed or damaged along key roads within a relatively short period. Whether every reported loss can be independently verified or not, the broader trend is becoming difficult to ignore. Supply movements are attracting increasing attention from Ukrainian operators looking for high-value targets. The reason is simple. Logistics vehicles often produce effects far beyond their individual size. When a tank is destroyed, one weapon system is removed from the battlefield. That loss matters, but its impact is usually limited to a specific area. A supply truck tells a different story. One vehicle may carry ammunition intended for multiple artillery batteries. Another may transport food for hundreds of personnel. A third may deliver spare parts needed to keep dozens of machines operational. The destruction of a single transport asset can create problems that spread far beyond the location of the strike itself. Fuel tankers may be even more important. Modern armies consume enormous amounts of fuel every day. Trucks, armored vehicles, generators, engineering equipment, and support systems all depend on a continuous supply. If deliveries are interrupted, movement slows. If movement slows, operations become harder to sustain. In some situations, a single lost tanker can affect an entire sector more than the loss of a combat vehicle. This is where the human side of logistics becomes visible. A burning truck on a remote highway is not simply a destroyed piece of equipment. It may represent thousands of artillery rounds that never reach frontline positions. It may carry drone batteries needed for future missions. It may contain medical supplies intended for wounded soldiers. The flames visible on one stretch of road can create consequences many kilometers away days later. That is why military professionals often pay close attention to logistics attacks, even when they receive less media coverage than major battles. An army can sometimes absorb losses in combat and continue advancing. Sustaining operations becomes much harder when supplies fail to arrive where they are needed. And as significant as these attacks have become, Ukraine is no longer limiting its efforts to roads, convoys, and transport vehicles alone. The most important change in Ukraine's campaign is that it is no longer focused only on vehicles moving along roads, but increasingly on every part of the system that keeps an army supplied and operational. Military logistics is often imagined as a line of trucks carrying ammunition and fuel to the front. In reality, it is a vast network made up of warehouses, power stations, communications centers, rail facilities, temporary storage sites, maintenance locations, and troop assembly areas. If enough pressure is applied across that network, the effects can spread far beyond the point of impact. Over the past several months, reports from occupied territories have pointed to a broader pattern of attacks targeting key support infrastructure in places such as Donetsk, Makivka, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Instead of concentrating on a single category of target, Ukrainian forces appear to be applying pressure across multiple layers at the same time. Fuel depots have been struck. Warehouses have come under attack. Communications facilities have faced repeated threats. Areas used for assembling personnel before deployment have also attracted attention. In several cases, rail-related infrastructure and transfer points have reportedly been targeted as well. To understand why this matters, it helps to think of military logistics as a chain, rather than a collection of separate facilities. Every link depends on another. Electricity powers communications equipment. Communications networks coordinate transportation schedules. Transportation delivers fuel and ammunition. Storage locations distribute supplies to combat units. Maintenance teams keep vehicles working. Remove one element, and pressure begins to spread through the entire structure. This is why military planners often worry less about spectacular explosions and more about interruptions that seem small at first. A destroyed warehouse makes headlines. A delayed shipment usually does not. Yet delays can sometimes create larger operational problems than a single dramatic strike. Modern military operations depend on timing. Supplies must arrive in the right place, at the right moment, and in the right quantity. When that process slows down, efficiency begins to disappear. Analysts often describe this approach as creating friction inside an opponent's system. The goal is not always total destruction. Sometimes the objective is simply to force difficult decisions. A convoy may need to take a longer route. A depot may have to relocate. Personnel may spend additional hours unloading supplies at night instead of during the day. Fuel reserves may need to be spread across multiple locations. Every adjustment consumes time, resources, and attention. Imagine a warehouse that survives an attack and remains standing. At first glance, it appears that little has changed, but the consequences may emerge gradually. Trucks arrive later than planned because routes have been adjusted. Fuel deliveries are postponed. Replacement drone batteries reach operators more slowly. Spare parts take longer to distribute. Artillery ammunition arrives behind schedule. Several days later, frontline units begin noticing that the flow of supplies is less reliable than before. None of these problems alone is likely to decide a campaign. Together, however, they can create a growing burden on commanders who must keep operations running under increasingly difficult conditions. This is especially important in a war where both sides rely heavily on technology, rapid communication, and constant movement. Small disruptions that occur repeatedly can accumulate into larger operational challenges over time. Military history offers many examples of armies adapting to losses on the battlefield. Replacing damaged equipment is often possible. Reorganizing units can be done. Finding new defensive positions may take time, but remains achievable. Repairing a system that is being pressured at multiple points simultaneously is often much harder. Every new problem competes for limited resources, and every solution creates additional demands elsewhere. What makes the current situation especially significant is that the pressure is not being applied to one city, one road, or one military base. It is being distributed across a wide area stretching through several key regions. The result is a growing sense that support infrastructure must constantly remain on alert, even far from active combat zones. And as these disruptions continue to accumulate, they are creating something military planners fear far more than occasional equipment losses or isolated attacks. They are creating the risk of systemic paralysis. The growing pressure on supply networks is no longer just a logistics problem. It is increasingly becoming a battlefield problem that can directly affect military operations across large sections of the front. Armies depend on far more than weapons and manpower. Every attack, every defensive position, and every movement requires a constant flow of resources. When that flow begins to slow, the effects eventually reach the soldiers doing the fighting. One of the first areas affected is the movement of reinforcements. Fresh personnel cannot simply appear at frontline positions. They must be transported from training centers, staging areas, and rear bases. Vehicles must be available. Routes must remain open. Fuel must be delivered. Commanders must coordinate schedules and destinations. When transportation becomes more difficult, the process of replacing losses takes longer, and units may be forced to operate below their intended strength. The same challenge applies to ammunition. Modern warfare consumes enormous quantities of artillery shells, rockets, small arms, ammunition, and drone munitions. Some sectors can fire thousands of rounds during periods of intense activity. Those stocks must be replenished continuously. If deliveries arrive late or in smaller quantities, commanders may be forced to conserve ammunition, reduce fire missions, or prioritize certain areas over others. The result may not be immediately visible, but over time, it can influence combat effectiveness. Fuel remains equally important. Tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, generators, engineering equipment, and support systems all depend on it. A military formation may possess significant firepower, but it cannot maneuver effectively if fuel supplies become unreliable. Mobility is often one of the most valuable assets on the battlefield, and mobility depends on transportation networks functioning properly. Maintenance operations face similar pressures. Combat vehicles operate under extremely demanding conditions. Engines wear down. Tires fail. Components break. Damaged systems require replacement parts and technical support. If those items arrive more slowly than before, repairs take longer and more equipment remains out of service. A machine sitting idle in a maintenance area contributes nothing to battlefield operations. Medical support is another critical factor. Casualties must be evacuated from combat zones and transported to treatment facilities. Medical supplies must move in the opposite direction. Every delay increases pressure on personnel already working under difficult conditions. While military discussions often focus on weapons, experienced commanders understand that healthcare and evacuation systems are essential parts of combat readiness. Analysts following developments in southern Ukraine have increasingly expressed concern about the cumulative effect these pressures may create. Russian formations operating across sectors stretching through southern regions depend on a continuous stream of resources moving from rear areas to forward positions. The longer supply routes remain under pressure, the greater the risk that disruptions begin affecting operational planning. An often overlooked aspect of this situation involves drones themselves. Drone warfare may appear highly modern and technologically advanced, but it still depends on logistics. Every unmanned aircraft requires batteries, replacement components, communication equipment, maintenance support, and in many cases specialized payloads. Thousands of drones are used across the battlefield, and those systems must be transported, stored, repaired, and distributed just like any other military equipment. This creates an important reality. A logistics crisis does not only weaken traditional forces, it can also weaken drone forces. The same trucks carrying fuel and ammunition may also transport batteries, electronics, antennas, controllers, and replacement aircraft. If supply movements become less reliable, the impact spreads across multiple parts of the military at the same time. Some analysts have warned that large numbers of personnel operating across sectors, extending from areas near Pokrovsk toward southern fronts, could eventually feel the consequences of prolonged disruptions. Exact numbers remain difficult to verify, but concerns continue to grow that extended pressure on logistics may affect substantial formations operating across a broad geographic area. The reason this matters is simple. Soldiers can endure discomfort for long periods. They can operate in poor weather. They can fight while tired. Yet there are limits to what determination alone can overcome. Troops cannot fire artillery without ammunition. Vehicles cannot move without fuel. Medical teams cannot function without supplies. No military can sustain operations indefinitely if resupply becomes unreliable. History repeatedly demonstrates this lesson. Armies rarely collapse because of one battle. They rarely disappear because of a single setback. More often, they weaken gradually as supply systems fail to keep pace with operational demands. Once that process begins, every additional challenge becomes harder to solve. Yet logistics is only one side of Russia's growing challenge. An equally serious problem is emerging within the force itself. The logistics challenge facing Russia becomes even more serious when viewed alongside another problem that has been developing throughout the war: the growing pressure on manpower. While supply networks are being tested across southern Ukraine, Russian forces continue to face casualties, recruitment demands, and the need to replace experienced personnel lost during years of continuous fighting. Together, these issues are creating a strategic dilemma that becomes harder to solve over time. Military analysts have repeatedly pointed out that replacing soldiers is not as simple as finding new recruits. Modern warfare requires trained operators, vehicle crews, drone specialists, communications personnel, engineers, and experienced junior leaders. As losses accumulate, maintaining the same level of experience becomes increasingly difficult. New personnel can fill positions, but training takes time, and battlefield knowledge cannot be replaced overnight. This creates a difficult situation for commanders. More troops may be available through recruitment campaigns or additional mobilization efforts, but those troops still need transportation, fuel, food, equipment, medical support, and protection from enemy attacks while moving toward operational areas. Every additional unit placed into the field increases demand on a logistics system that is already under pressure. That reality has led some observers to describe what is happening as a drone trap. The concept is simple but powerful. The more personnel Russia commits to the battlefield, the more supplies must be delivered. The more supplies that must be delivered, the more vehicles appear on roads. The more vehicles appear on roads, the more targets become available for Ukrainian drone operators. In other words, every effort to strengthen frontline formations can also create new vulnerabilities behind them. This is one reason why attacks on transportation routes are receiving so much attention from military experts. Moving soldiers from rear areas to combat zones becomes more complicated when convoys, staging points, and support infrastructure face constant observation. Even if losses remain limited, commanders may be forced to adjust routes, spread out movements, and spend additional resources protecting transportation corridors. Some analysts believe this represents a major turning point in the evolution of warfare. For centuries, distance provided a degree of safety. Armies expected the greatest danger near active combat zones, while support areas farther away operated with greater freedom. New technology is steadily reducing that advantage. Low-cost drones, combined with surveillance networks and real-time intelligence, are extending the reach of the battlefield in ways that were once difficult to imagine. And that leads to a much larger question. The story is no longer about a single convoy, a single highway, or even one sector of the front. It is increasingly becoming a story about the future of warfare itself. The convoy that left before dawn at the beginning of this story was never really the main story. What matters is what that convoy represents. Across southern Ukraine, areas once considered safe are becoming part of the battlefield, and Russia is facing growing pressure not only at the front, but deep behind it. As Ukrainian drones reach farther and strike more often, roads, fuel supplies, warehouses, and transport networks are becoming increasingly difficult to protect. For military planners around the world, the lesson is becoming clear. Firepower alone cannot sustain an army. Ammunition must arrive. Fuel must keep flowing. Reinforcements must reach their positions. When that system begins to break down, battlefield problems quickly follow. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to Military Force and let us know in the comments. Could drone warfare permanently change the way future wars are fought?